Hi, my name is Kevin Jones, and in this talk, I'll show you how to use the rock-solid knowledge FIDO component to do passwordless authentication. So before we write any code, let's just take a look at where we are going. So this is a standard ASP.NET web application that supports authentication, but I've made a couple of changes. The first is that I've changed the privacy link so that if I click on this, we require authentication. And as we can see in this case, it requires us to use an authenticator rather than using username and password. And that's the second change I've made. I've changed the application to allow us to register a FIDO device and then to log on using that device. To register the device, we click on the register link. We type in the email address of the user. So let's use kevin@rocksolidknowledge.com. And we have to give the device a name. Now the device I'm using here is Dashlane, a password manager. So I'll call this Dashlane. The device name could be anything. If I click on submit, we then have to interact with the device to allow us to register this new passkey. Dashlane pops up a dialog. I click on confirm. I enter my master password. And the device is now registered. Now, when I click on login, it again asks me to use this authenticator. Dashlane pops up the dialog, I click on confirm, and I'm now authenticated. And if I now click on the privacy link, we get to the page, and to show that we are authenticated, we print out the list of this user's claims. So now that we've seen that, let's go and write the code to put all of this in place. So I'm using JetBrains Rider for this, but you could equally as well do this inside Visual Studio, or you could use the command line tools to create this new project. I'm giving the project a name of Passwordless. It's going to be a model view controller web app, and we're going to use individual authentication. So let's click on create, and that creates this standard project for me. Now this project is going to use FIDO, and in fact it's going to use the rock-solid knowledge FIDO component. So the first thing we need to do is to install that component. So if I bring up NuGet, and search for rsk.fido, we'll find these two packages, the rsk ASP.NET Core.fido package and the fido.entity framework package. I'm going to add both of those into the project. Initially, we won't use Entity Framework, but we will see how to use that at the end of this talk. With those packages installed, I now need to add the FIDO component to my application. Now, this component requires a key. And we can get that key from the Identity Server website. So if I go to identityserver.com, products, fido.net, so here we can register and we'll be sent a free 30-day demonstration key. I already have that key, so I won't go through that process again. So to add this component, I go into program.cs and then I configure the component. To do that, we call builder.services.add FIDO. Now this function call takes an action that allows us to configure the component. So here we can say options goes to, and inside the options, we set two fields. We set the license E field. Now the licensee in this case will be demo. And we set the license key field. And that license key will be whatever value you got back when you registered at identityserver.com. So let me put my key into here. Now, when we use this component, we have to store the FIDO information somewhere. At the end of this talk, we'll see how to store that in a database. But for now, we'll just call add in memory key store. And we'll use an in-memory store for the data we are saving as part of this FIDO registration and as part of the logon process. Now, when we use FIDO, we have to do two things. We have to register the component, and then we have to log in using that component. And the flow for both of these is very similar. So let me walk you through the registration flow. Now notice, there are a number of players here. There's the browser, there's the server, there's a database, and then there's the authenticator. And the authenticator is a component within the browser that allows us to interact with FIDO devices. So the steps are this. The user comes along and enters their user details. And in our case, that will be their username or email address and the name they want to use for this FIDO component. Those details are entered into a screen at the browser. The browser sends those details to the server, and the server will kick off the registration process. When we do that, we'll insert the user into the database, and then we'll do what's known as start registration. When we start registration, that will send what's known as a challenge back to the browser. This FIDO challenge is passed on to the authenticator component through some JavaScript code. And in the JavaScript code, we use something called a navigator, and we call it navigator.credentials.create. If that succeeds, the authenticator passes some public key credentials back to the browser. The browser sends those credentials back to the server, and the server then completes the registration. So for this to work, we need some user interface to allow us to enter the user details. We need some code in the server to kick off and complete this registration process, and that code will use our FIDO component. We'll also need some JavaScript code to interact with the browser. So let's start at the server. So in the server, I'm going to add a new class, and we'll use that class to manage all the interaction with our FIDO component. So under controllers, I'll do add, and we'll add a controller, and I'm going to call this FIDO controller. We don't need the index method, so let me get rid of that. Now remember, for registration, there are two things we need to do. We need to start the registration process, and we need to complete the registration process. The first thing we do when we're starting the process is ask the user for their username and for the device name. So to do that, I'm going to add a method here, which returns an iAction result, and we'll call this start registration. And all this method will do is return a view back to the user, and that view will allow the user to enter their username and enter the device name. So let's do return view from here. Now this view doesn't currently exist. So to create it, let me go into the project, into views, add a new directory called FIDO, and then an MVC view called start registration. Now the start registration UI will look like this. We'll have a form, and into that form we'll enter the user's email and the device name. And we're going to save that data into a class called registration. So let me add that class as well. So if I go into models and add a new class called registration, and that class will look like this. We'll ask for the email, and that will be required, and we'll ask for the device name, and that will also be required. And back in start registration, we just need to add the appropriate references. So our model is passwordless.models.registration. Now at the moment, we have the code to present the user interface to our user. They will enter the email, they will enter the device name, they'll then click on the submit button, and it's going to send a post back to a method called register. Now this register method will then kick off the FIDO registration process. So back in the controller, I'm going to add a registration method, and that will look like this. It takes a reference to the registration model, it's async, and it's marked with HTTP post and with validate anti-forgery token. Now inside this method, I need to do two things. I need to create the user inside the ASP.NET identity database, and I need to start the FIDO registration. And I can only do this if the model, the registration model, is valid. So there's a few things to add here first of all. Let me add a constructor to this controller, and then into this constructor, I want to pass a reference to something called FIDO Authentication. And this is the interface we're going to use to interact with the FIDO component. I'm going to call this FIDO. I also need a reference to the user manager, and this comes from ASP.NET Identity. And the generic type here is going to be identity user. And let's just call this user manager. Now, I'm not going to need this now, but I will need it later. I'm also going to add a reference to the sign-in manager. And again, that's of type identity user, and we'll just call that sign-in manager. And for each of these, let me create a private field and assign these values to that field. Okay, so in the register function, the first thing I want to do is check the model state. So I can say if model state.is valid, then we're going to register the user with identity and we'll initiate the FIDO registration process. To register the user with identity, I need to create an instance of identity user. So I can say var user equals new identity user. And into this, we want to pass the username and the email address. And I'm going to use the same value for both. So username equals model.email and email address equals model.email. To register this user with identity, I'm going to call underscore user manager dot create async. And into create async, I'll pass this user. And this will return me a result. So I can say var result equals await create async. If that result succeeded, I can then initiate the FIDO registration process. To do that, I'm going to await on a call to underscore FIDO dot initiate registration. To initiate registration, I need to pass the user ID, and that user ID will be the email, and I need to pass the device name. And again, we get that from the model. This returns me something of type FIDO registration challenge, and we'll just call this challenge. And this FIDO registration challenge, we're going to pass back to the browser, and the browser is then going to use the information in this challenge to talk to the FIDO device. So to do that, I'm going to return a view, and into that view, I'm going to pass this challenge. Now, this challenge is a C# object, so I can't just send this back in the view and expect the view to send it back to the browser. Instead, what I'm going to do is to make a base64 version of this challenge and then send that back to the browser. I also want to put some error handling in here. So if the result didn't succeed, we're going to return an error. And then if the model isn't valid, I'm just going to go back to the start registration page. So again, let me create an empty Razor view. And then to this view, add a reference to this base64 FIDO registration challenge. Now this view is going to talk to the authenticator inside the browser. And to do that, we need some JavaScript. So in my project, I've added this file called fido.js. And it's this JavaScript that talks to the authenticator and does the client-side part of FIDO. Remember, it's the RSK component working on the server side, and then we have this standard JavaScript that's working on the client side. Now, this JavaScript has a function called register, and that's the function we want to call from inside this view. So inside here, I want to add two things. I'm going to add a header, which says, please use your authenticator, and I'm going to add a reference to this JavaScript file, and then I'm going to call that register function. Now, when I call this function, I'm going to take data out of this base64 FIDO registration challenge. We're going to pass through something called the base64 challenge. We're going to pass through the relying party ID. We pass through something called the base64 user handle, and we pass through the user ID, and we finally pass through a callback URL. And that callback URL we need to implement. So what does this function actually do? So if I look inside this register function, it first of all calls this helper, getChallengeAstring, that takes the base64 challenge we pass in and turns it into something called a uint8 array, which is a data type that our JavaScript code can use. So further down here, we make use of this relying party ID. We make use of this user handle, again turning it into a uint array, and we create a user object based on the user ID and the user handle. And then finally, we make this call to navigator.credentials.create, passing in all of this data. And if this succeeds, we get back this set of credentials, which again we encode. So basically, this is base64 encoded. We are then using jQuery's AJAX call to send these encoded credentials back to the server. And we're sending them back to this callback URL. Remember, if I look inside register.cshtml, the callback URL is /fido/complete registration. When this data gets back to the server will use these encoded credentials to complete registration on our FIDO device. If that succeeds, we set window.location.href to be the home page. So we just redirect back to the home page on the server. If it fails, we print out an error. Now, one thing to check here, the port here is currently set to 7004. If I look inside launch settings, we're going to be running on 7144. So let me change that address to be 7144. And later on, when we do a login, we'll also have a redirect. And again, that needs to be the correct port. Okay, so with that in place, we now need to write the code behind the return URL, i.e. we need to add this complete registration endpoint. So back in the controller, I need a function called complete registration. Again, it's going to be an async function, and this takes two parameters. It takes the username, and the username is passed on the query string on the callback, and it takes this base64 FIDO registration response. And that is passed back as the data, i.e. that's these encoded credentials. The base64 FIDO registration response type comes from the RSK FIDO component. Now, in the register method, I called initiate registration. In this method, I'm going to take my FIDO component and call complete registration. And to this, I need to pass a FIDO registration response. So I can say registration response dot to FIDO response. Again, this is an async call, so I await on it, and this returns me something of type iFIDO registration result. So let's say result equals. Then here I can check that result. So I can say if result dot is error, then we have a problem. And in that case, I'm just going to delete the user from the ASP.NET identity database. And this is the user we created in the register method. However, if we've completed registration, then we're good to go. And I'm just going to return OK from this call. Now, I want to test this code out. But before we do that, there are a couple of links that we have to change. If I go into _ login partial.cshtml, then at the bottom here, we can see we have a link to register the user and a link to log in the user. And these currently go to the standard account register and account login endpoints. We don't want that now. Instead, we want these to go to the FIDO controller. So I want to replace these two list items with this code instead. So for register, we'll go to the start registration endpoint, and then for login, we'll go to the login endpoint, both of these on the FIDO controller. Now, currently we don't have a login endpoint. We'll add that in a moment. So let's run the application and see if registration works. Now be careful. You get the option to run this on HTTP or HTTPS. For me, using Dashlane, I have to run this on HTTPS, otherwise it doesn't work correctly. So let me run this. So we're inside the application. I can click on register. Here I can enter my name, so Kevin at rocksolidknowledge.com. And I can enter a device name. And again, we can use Dashlane as the device name. If I click on submit, we are now interacting with our authenticator, i.e. with Dashlane. So I can click on confirm, enter my master password, click on unlock, and this FIDO device has now been saved to Dashlane, and my user information has been saved to ASP.NET Identity. Okay, so there are two more steps. We have to do login, and then we'll add Entity Framework support. So with registration done, we can now add login. And that's going to be very similar. So inside my FIDO controller, we can add a login method. And again, here we're going to use the FIDO component, but this time we're going to call initiate authentication rather than initiate registration. And to this, we can just pass the value null. Again, this returns a challenge. And that challenge is of type FIDO authentication challenge. So we can say challenge equals await initiate authentication. And again, I want to pass this challenge off to the browser. So I'm going to return a view, which we'll create in a moment. And into this, we pass challenge. And again, we base64 encode it. So to base64 DTO. Again, for the view, I go to the FIDO folder inside views, and we add a view called login. And the view looks like this. Again, we include the FIDO.js file, but this time we call a function called complete login. And that function looks like this. Again, we turn our base64 challenge into a uint8 array. And again, we use this relying party ID. This time, rather than calling navigator.credentials.create, we call navigator.credentials.get. If that succeeds, we'll create this encoded result. And again, we're going to send that encoded result back to the server. This time, we're going to send it back to this FIDO complete login URL. Inside the FIDO complete login URL, we'll complete the login. And if we return OK back to this AJAX call, then we'll end up being redirected back to the home page. So in the FIDO controller, we need to add a complete login function. And that will look like this. It's going to take a base64 FIDO authentication response. And then inside here, we're going to call FIDO.completeAuthentication. And we're going to pass it this authentication response. But again, we need to decode it. This call returns something of type iFIDO authentication result. So we can say result equals, and again, we need to await on the call. Now, if this result is successful, then we need to sign in our user using ASP.NET Identity. So to do that, we first need to find the user using the user manager. So I can say var user equals await and then underscore user manager dot find by email async. Now the email is in the result object and it's in the user ID field. So we can say result.user ID. Once I have this user, we can await on the sign-in manager that I added earlier. And we call it sign-in async method, passing in the user, and then false as our persistence flag. Now, obviously here, I'm assuming both of these calls are going to work. Now, in a production application, you'll need to provide some error handling here. Now, if the result is an error, I'm going to return a bad request. And into that bad request, we'll say result.error description. And then finally, if everything is okay, I'm just going to return OK. And that should be it. We should be good to go. So again, if I run this, and starting from the beginning, we can register. So again, I'll register Kevin at rocksolidknowledge.com. Give a device name of Dashlane. Click on Submit. Interact with my device. Click on Confirm and enter my password. And we're now registered. If I click on Login, again, it asks me to use the authenticator. Click on Confirm. And we are now logged in. And we can see at the top, it says, hello, Kevin at rocksolidknowledge.com. And that's my user ID. Now I can add one more thing to this to prove that we are logged in. So if I go to the home controller and on the privacy endpoint, add an authorize attribute. And then inside the privacy view, show the list of claims for this user. So if I go back to the browser and log out, if I click on privacy, it asks me to log in. Now, at the moment, it's using the wrong page for that, and we'll fix that in a moment. But if I go to my login tab here, it asks me to use the authenticator. Click on confirm, we logged in. And now if I go to privacy, we hit the page and we can see the claims. What about this problem? When I log out and I click on privacy, we go to the original ASP.NET Identity login page. But we can fix that. So if I go back into my code and inside program.cs, here I can configure the cookie to use the correct login path. So I call builder.services.configureApplicationCookie and then set the login path to be FIDO/login. And this replaces the original login path. If I restart the application, go back to the browser and then click on the privacy link, now it takes me to the new login page. And again, we can click on confirm and we're now logged in. If I go back to the privacy page, again, we can see the page and we can see the claims. Now, there's still one issue here. And the issue is that we're only using the in-memory store for our FIDO component. So let me show you this. If I log out here, I go back to Rider and I restart the application. If I go back to the browser and try and log in, it asks me to interact with the device. The device knows my information. Click on confirm, but login fails. And it fails because I'm not storing my FIDO information in a database. I'm storing it in memory. So when I restart the process, that information gets lost. So to fix that, we need to use Entity Framework. So back in my code, let me stop the server. And then here inside program.cs, rather than calling add in memory store, I want to call add entity framework store. Now for this, I need to pass a couple of options. So we can say options goes to, and to this I'm going to say options.useSQLite. That's the database we're using. And to this, I'm going to pass the connection string. And then as a second parameter to useSQLite, I want to configure migrations. So to this, I'm going to say dbopt goes to, and then inside that callback, say dbopt.migrationAssembly, and we need to give this the name of the assembly that contains the migrations. So to get that, I'm going to say type of FIDO controller.assembly.fullname. Now, once I have that, I can generate the migrations. So inside Rider, if I go to the Terminal tab, make sure I'm in the project directory. Then from here, I can generate the migrations for my FIDO component. So for that, I say .NET EF migrations add. I give these migrations a name. So let's call them FIDO migrations. And then specify the name of the DB context, which for the FIDO component is FIDO DB context. Hit return, and that will generate the migrations for me. And they'll be added into this migrations folder. Once I have that, I can update the database. Now, what I'm going to do is if I go into the project, I'm going to delete the SQLite database. And I'm going to recreate this from scratch. To do that, I call .NET EF database update -C, and the first DB context I'm going to pass this is the default one for identity. So that's application DB context. And that will create the database for me and apply the identity migrations. Once I have those, I can then call the same function, but say -C FIDO DB context. And that will apply the FIDO migrations for me. If I open the database tab inside Rider and drag the DB file into that and say, okay, look inside main and look at the tables, we can see the ASP.NET table and we can see this FIDO keys table. So that's the FIDO information. So now I can run the application again. I can go back to the browser, click on register. Remember, I've just recreated the database. Type in kevin@rocksolidknowledge.com. Again, the device name will be Dashlane. Click on submit. Confirm to my authenticator. Click on the privacy tab. Confirm that I want to authenticate. So I get logged in. We can see I'm logged in as we have my hello kevin@rocksolidknowledge.com in the navigation bar. Click on privacy again and we can see the claims. If I go back to Rider and restart the server, go back to the browser and log out just to clear all the cookies. If I log in again and confirm, then sure enough, we're now logged in. So even though I've restarted the process, the data is now being stored in a database and is not being lost. And we can click on privacy and we can see the claims again. And if I go back to Rider and again go to my database window and click on the query console, from here I can do a select star from FIDO keys and we can see this data in that table. Thank you for watching and I hope you found this talk useful. You can find the sample code for this at github.com/kevinrjones/rsk-identity-passwordless.